So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Henri Pirkkalainen. I'm actually a colleague of Jussi, but Jussi was before in the same unit that I am at. But nowadays we work with the different units. But the funny thing is that we work in areas that have a lot of overlaps, but at the same time we have a different standing point to the issue. So I think in the presentation you'll probably see a lot of overlaps, and you have to maybe think about how does this relate to information ergonomics, or when I'm discussing some concepts about like certain technostressors or ways of coping, you probably will see and have to do a bit of a 1+1. And I think that's a good thing of the overlap of these two presentations. So yeah, I've been now in Tampere for 7 years. I'm now associate professor there at Information and Knowledge Management. And personally, I'm my background is in information systems science. I've tried to make sense of why and how people use and adopt technology. So when I defended my PhD in 2014, like at that time, this concept that I'm now talking about wasn't as major in any of the academic disciplines, not so much discussed in practice too much. I mean, there were some indications maybe in the news and so on around social media that something is happening, but it was clear that there's something coming our way that we need to understand better. And that's why we kind of sat down with one colleague of mine in Jyväskylä and thought about it. Okay, let's try to figure it out in terms of, like, as researchers, and dig into it with different types of methods and find out what is this kind of a technostress that is often referred to a bit of a kind of one example of the dark side of information systems. So that's an area that I've been quite passionate about in the last few years. And to kind of also the background, I tend, or we in our team tend to work with different types of technologies. So we often look at what's happening in different industries and in the work life. For instance, lately we have been studying the use of new technologies such as extended reality, or sometimes we call it the metaverse. But we also deal with blockchains and more traditional, like communication tools that allow people to work remotely together. But many of our studies also take place in large society and also non-work, so more or less daily situations. So I've tried to put a bit of a kind of a combination to this one, so that it kind of reflects to the work life, but at the same time the connection points to our daily lives is obvious. And first of all, how many of you have heard the term technostress before? Maybe raise your hands. A few of you, very good. So basically, the concept isn't any way new. I mean, it's as old as me. And now you might guess, like, how old is he? Maybe he's 25. I'm close to 40. But 83 it actually originated from work life. And maybe I would like to, before explaining too much about what technostress is, and just a bit of a warm you up, try to do some guesses. 83, from which part of working life, which industry, what kind of a work technostress originally originated from? It was workers in certain work situations. Try to guess. And again, there's only one correct answer, but there might be many options where it comes. So 83, where did the technostress term first come up with? IT, that's close, but not particularly IT. Data science? No. Maybe more. What? Which one?
Study.
Music?
Yes.
Music. It wasn't also from music. No. Further guesses? Think about public sector. Public sector. What? Sorry? Yes. No.
Logistics.
Health, logistics.
Yeah.
Good answer. Good. I mean, all of these could be there. Could be, but should I give you the answer?
Yeah.
Or libraries. My wife is a librarian, so she was like, obviously. I mean, at that time, 40 years ago, like technostress basically came from people who had to actually go to a certain place in their office to like search information. And of course, there were different tasks that were managed in libraries, 40 years ago. But at that time, it basically just meant when the technology just didn't work as you wanted to work, in a way that at that time, of course, the usability and issues with that probably used to talk quite a lot also about work, maybe to the extent that they are nowadays when you use Apple devices or PCs or similar. So that it mainly related to things that are crashing and don't work as you would like them to, and that was the kind of the source of Technostress. But over the years, it kind of was like that for maybe 20, 30 years. There wasn't even no one in science, no one in practically in a work life were discussing about the term Technostress until maybe something like 2010, 2011, when there started to be more of these indications from work life that something is happening. But it started to, at that time, already turn into something more complex. It wasn't anymore just like the technology is malfunctioning and that irritates people. And we're going to discuss a bit what that consists of, because it's more times it's quite personal. It's really subjective on the in terms of really what bugs people off and how it might consume people also, rather somehow in quite hidden ways. So basically the concept of Technostress, as you might imagine, that it kind of originates from psychology and everyday stress. So, and it's basically just like stress caused by IT use. So Technostress has been connected to different types of technologies. It can be something when you work with laptops, certain types of different types of handheld devices that you carry around, smartphones. But there's also like many studies that go deeper into certain types of technology use environments, in, for instance, social media, particularly to Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And what has been found in the recent years is that many of these different technologies, and especially like different types of applications, in a way that they are designed and in a way that they have been adopted over the years, is that there are very different forms of Technostress happening, which makes it also a bit more complex, like a topic in a way. Many scholars already some few years ago thought that, hey, we've already heard it. We know that it's an issue. Why should we any more care? We've acknowledged it. But then when it started to figure out that, hey, but when you take, for instance, Twitter and people, the ways how people use it, its forms are really different. And it might not be anymore too much something that the person him herself can control. It's something maybe in the network of who you're using with and the purposes you're using it for. And that's something what I think has been really interesting about Technostress, why I keep on coming back to this topic. And when I close one project or like a research paper on Technostress, that I already know that, hey, there's something that we just don't know about it yet. With the Technostress, basically there are like why it became interested, why people became interested about was mainly because of some kind of outcomes of Technostress. And this is how usually Technostress is like understood, in a way that there's some things that cause it, there are some kind of obvious effects of it that might be related to your daily life or work life. So basically in the last couple of decades, there have been more and more of the studies like indications that it has outcome mainly on your psychology, to your mind, body, and or your behavior. And I think one of the main reasons why I think where that sparked a lot of research around Technostress was when there started to be indications that there are actually proof of its relation to severe strain that goes over time. So something like burnout. And especially in workplaces when they couldn't really decipher what's causing this, that it's not everyday stress. It's not just that the technology is operating a certain way, but there are some patterns of use maybe, and the way technology is embedded to our lives that leads to burnout. That's, I think, when it was a wake-up call for many industries also, and they started to demand that, hey, we need to understand this better. There have also over the years been a lot of studies that identify, of course, its effects on how well they sleep, and of course that's something that probably most of us can relate to, is that late night use of smartphones and similar, and you probably see it in the news, but there are more evidence of that. Just the browsing of the screen before and activating your brain before going to sleep is sometimes not so good for overall for your health. But it's also like this. In the work life, what we have been often studying it is relates to how people perform in their work and how they consider themselves performing at work. So when they were starting to be more like this indication that people's productivity is going down over time, and again trying to figure out what's the reason, that's something of the connections to Technostress that many people don't necessarily think about too much. They often think about this more psychological, some kind of a strain, some kind of effects of your overall well-being. But the thing is, when it starts to hit your motivation and everyday work, that's where especially also the scientific community became even more interested about this topic. So usually when starting to understand what Technostress is, you kind of have to go through the sources of it. And as mentioned, like 40 years ago, it was basically that technology was being something of a complicated thing and it was crashing all the time. But I'm not sure how many of you nowadays, when you're using a smartphone, certain social media application, think that it's really hard to use or that it doesn't work the way you want to. Probably in many cases you find that the usability of these tools is pretty good in a way, and you see particular value of using it. So from the kind of I think from the frustrations and irritations of technology not working the way you want, that's the kind of the really old school way of thinking of Technostress, but it still has its relevance for modern day work. And what we've identified especially is when we work with newer technologies, when we start to bring virtual reality, try to embed it into some work settings, or try to have like leisure activities in VR, we find out that it's actually much harder to use and more complicated to integrate as a part of our everyday behavior as we would think. So I think it still has kind of its like a significance to what we understand, but especially I think in the era of when internet started to flow more into the work life, and when more and more data was available to us for finding information for, I don't know, recipes for cooking or something about how you could perform your work, the concept of information overload was very early on connected to Technostress, and probably information overload is something that, and information load is what you also discussed the previous presentation. So information overload is something of its big jungle of its own that people try to make sense of in different disciplines. We as information systems researchers, people in psychology, social psychology, they have the same topic, but a bit different question to how it can be managed. And I think that's one of the most challenging areas definitely of Technostress, into ways how you manage different types of data flows and kind of keep the burden away from your mind in a sense. But the kind of the newer, let's say, indications of Technostress somehow are more and more social in nature, and that's probably one of the reasons why us in many cases use technology on a daily basis, that it allows us to stay connected to friends and family, also to online conversations, just news, but just like keeping in touch with the world and what's happening around, and communicating with others. And same as in work life, to have the access and opportunity to stay connected with our colleagues, just to make sure that we can do our job better and better. That's probably one of the hardest places of navigating Technostress, because more and more social things become, the more and more there's also other issues than yourself in terms of how you can keep Technostress in your own hand. So probably there's the kind of evolution that has been that can be seen in terms of Technostress, but still I would probably think that if you are later on, someone asks you what Technostress is about, I think one of the key ways of trying to understand it is via IT interruptions. And I think this is something probably that Jussi was also speaking about briefly, maybe to some extent. So, I mean, there have been a lot of studies about this amount of different types of interruptions that, for instance, knowledge workers who are dependent on IT use for their work activities, is how many different types of IT interruptions they have per workday. And I think some of these older statistics, maybe they aren't calculated to the point, but still having indications that your work is being interrupted maybe 70 to 100 times per day is still quite a big number. And because it's usually the recovery time that is the most problematic in terms of how long it takes until you're actually back to what you were doing in the first place. There was one journalist who actually, after listening to my presentation, was testing it, or actually calculating how many interruptions he got during a workday, and he got something like 320 interruptions. So you can think about it, if it even takes 30 seconds to recover from an interruption, was he even working that particular day? But I think that's the kind of a reality that we nowadays deal with, because the technology kind of gives us the chance to be connected. It's much harder often to do some kind of a cut, some trade-off in a way that you have to lose also something. So I think some of the studies that have shown that 1/3 of the workday, for instance, could be just dealing with different types of interruptions. I think that's quite alarming, but that also is kind of a pretty good indication to why technostress remains a topic that somehow needs to be dealt with. Just to maybe this is a bit of a recap to what Jussi was talking about, but maybe I think it's really important to categorize and understand what interruptions are like, what is their actual nature in a way, and what you yourself can control. Basically, I mean, the most typical way of finding out interruptions is that, again, that they are external and they are something coming your way in terms of notifications, pop-up screens, your laptop maybe having some kind of a links and sounds saying that, okay, there might be a message from your colleague or a new email coming to your inbox, or your WhatsApp, your mom is saying that, hey, are you coming for dinner, or something similar. So that there's constantly different types of information flows that are coming with notifications that take your attention away from what you were doing in the first place. So of course, this is one of the classic of this. The other one is basically when the technology itself kind of interrupts you in a way of system malfunctions or something of the technical errors that of course are always possible in a way. But the more and more these topics have been studied in the previous years, I think the most common one starts to be the interrupting oneself. And I'm not sure if Jussi talked about this, but there have been, of course, brain researchers, social psychologists, IS scholars who were also identified that when there's repeated patterns all the time when you're kind of getting interruptions and notifications in a way, is that the mastery of it, that you kind of feel a kind of I don't know, it's kind of rewarding in many ways also to be in charge of computer in a way that you can manage so many things at the same time. But when you're actually starting to crop out some of those interruptions and managing your devices, is that it allows you a lot of more times for a day to be actually bored. And being bored is something that we humans don't tolerate very well. And so basically it forces us to kind of switch our behavior in a way that we are seeking for the next thing that can keep us occupied. That's a bit kind of the thing that why people ask, what's the difference between technostress and IT addiction, Peter? It's thin line between these topics, because there have been more even studies now that show that when we are extremely consumed by information, that we feel that we are overloaded, in the sense that we feel that there's not much more processing that we can do in our minds. Is that is the moment where we might get more and more addicted, because it's also it might be a way for us to also cope and go for searching for the next thrill in a way, and keep our, manage our brain load in some sense. But this is the kind of one of the core things what makes managing technostress hard, because we don't necessarily want to control it too much. And maybe that's something that I want to ask you from yourself, because the reflecting part is usually the hardest part. Acknowledging, yeah, there is that, and it's under control. But when you start to kind of monitor your own behavior, at least in myself, I see a lot of patterns like this and at work, and I know that it's taking some tax, for instance, from my work motivation, my productivity, but I still keep on doing it. And I think that's something of like finding out, why people are doing that. But that's something that like we can come to that maybe in some discussion still during this one. But I mean, we have to remember that especially in everyday life, in work life, if there wouldn't be any interruptions, I'm not sure if any things would get done in a way. We still are dependent on collaboration with our colleagues. Many of the tasks in work settings are designed in a way that there are different experts from different fields that need to work together to make things actually come together. So there are also these relevant interruptions that aids us to keep focus, keep on doing the good job. So that's why, it might be one of the easiest things to think about, like managing this kind of a interruption space is that, okay, cut it to minimum. But in many ways, cutting to minimum means also that you're maybe losing something that makes you better at what you're doing in your work life. So that's the kind of the balancing act, definitely, that needs to be considered. So here comes the kind of the connection between the IT interruptions and information overload. Is that, of course, I'm not sure that used to talk about this much, but I mean the amount of information that we must master nowadays in daily life, but also in no matter in which job you're nowadays, is I think the expectations for workers nowadays are much more than they were before, because you have to navigate the information and like extensive exponential data, like data spaces in a way to make sense of what is relevant and what is not. And you can just think about it that like some decades ago, even people weren't in the same situation. I mean, just like 20 years ago, I remember, like, for my own way of, like, when I started to get into work life, is that it still was very different. So that there's a corner in my room where I use the computer, where I get connected via the modem that might be slow as hell, but still that I can get online or something like that. But just that's, it feels like a long time ago, but we should just remember, always remember that nowadays we are under like different types of pressures, especially via this like information flows that are coming our way. And this is the kind of the thing of the, like, where Technostress studies, especially like 10 years ago, were focusing quite much about this, about the concept of information overload, is that, which is also a bit about the information ergonomics in terms of like how much like foldering you have to do basically in your work. So that there's, of course, might be something about that there's just too much information available. That was often the kind of the classic way of like thinking about information overload. Just too much. But in most cases, and especially nowadays, when you navigate any kind of information feed, just try it yourself. Maybe after this, we are LinkedIn feed or something like that. Just like browse it quickly and try to figure out how much of the information is relevant for yourself. And when it's not relevant, is that how much of extra processing power you put to your brain in a way to kind of organize it into certain folders. So when we talk about the social media, one of the key issues has been lately this social overload. Early on, some people said that it's mostly about that there are too many communications, that this is what is the key issue about social media. Too many online communications that kind of make people suffer from technostress, and that kind of comes up with social problems at home, or it kind of like starts to like somehow pick on your motivation for working. But lately it's also being understood much more that the different types of social interaction that there might take place in different types of platforms can be quite taxing. And some of the latest studies are also identifying, the kind of the conflicts in terms of, depending on what kind of a conversation people get dragged into in social media, is that they seem to have different effects for different people. Some are getting extremely excited by the maybe quite polarized discussions. Maybe someone have looked at Twitter anytime in last previous years, or X, how it's called nowadays. But anyways, it can be quite taxing. But you can also, what was quite interesting to see is that how people, the differences therein, so that some getting extremely excited about the conflicts and being maybe thrown into a conversation, and some people just stopping the use of technology when there starts to be that indications. And that was also shown in the work technologies, so that when there start to be some debates or similar, people actually don't follow any of so they are intentionally dropping out of some discussions that could be relevant, but might have some kind of a heated discussions or similar like that. So it's not just like something that people can choose that, hey, now I don't use Twitter or similar, but it might be that it's work technology that you should be using, but at the same time, you're finding that it's too much for you. And that's the kind of the subjective part, what makes Technostress really, problematic, because one person's Technostress isn't the other person's Technostress. So it's been basically identified that there are multiple different types of Technostress creators. And again, if you would start to think about your own use of certain technology and think about what is really relevant for you, and look back about when you have been maybe like over time being strained by some of these issues, is that probably we all would give to some extent a different combination of these factors if we would have to prioritize. But that's exactly the thing, is that it's a unique combination for people depending on of their lives, and this list is pretty much getting longer all the time, and it depends quite much of the actual technology use environment. Again, there's a Facebook logo. It's Meta nowadays, as you might know, but still Facebook term, well known. But it's basically in a way rooted in the technology and its features, characteristics. That kind of is the sparking part for the technology, and that's something that usually at workplace isn't often thought about enough. Is that by the choice of tools sets that you use and the ability to, for instance, customize them for certain purposes, would have a tremendous effect on how people actually leading all the way to reduced motivation, reduced productivity, and so on, because they haven't necessarily considered for Technostress. So we're going to discuss a bit about that before I end, about the different technologies and how they might spark it. But if you have to think about what Technostress is, and if someone asks you later on, it's usually that they are those stress creators and outcomes that how we come to understand it. But it definitely goes back to the characteristic features, what makes a certain device, certain application unique, good in many ways, but also why it relates to the unintended negative outcomes. Because again, we have to remember that these are unintended. The designers probably didn't think about it. The users definitely didn't think about it, but someone is suffering from it. So that's the thing. One thing, this is by the way, a complete overload slide. Don't worry about it. So if I'm talking about being overloaded with information, probably you would have it here. But in a few years ago, I think there starts to be a much better understanding that people go through different routes. If you don't read about anything about the slides, but understand that they're basically two different pathways for us, so that basically the same kind of a situation when there's a lot of information coming our way and people are reading, for instance, Twitter or LinkedIn feed in a very fast pace and try to make sense out of it. Why some people go to the path of distress in a way, so that it starts to somehow irritate them, or that they are feeling that they are consuming too much of their brain power in a way. They don't necessarily know that they are strained, but in the end there might be some really negative outcomes in after a week or after a month or after a couple of years of using that kind of technology. And why for some it's this kind of a use-stress path, in a way that it's the same kind of a situation is sparked more of a kind of a curiosity, more kind of a positive challenge. So that's the kind of the positive and negative stress pathway that I think we just don't understand good enough nowadays. I think that's one, at least my argument would be that we don't understand good enough why for certain technologies, certain situations. For instance, if you take a work group of 10 people, 10 colleagues, is that why for like 6 of them, it's this path that goes to really bad place, and why for some it's just a positive thing that triggers positive growth, good outcomes, and good outcomes. So that's the kind of and probably I don't have the answer for it, but I mean maybe you have for your own case. But often the problem is that in a work life, it's not just you, it's always also your work community. So you are never using technology in a confined space where you're alone. Last couple of years, we have been looking at this kind of this mitigating coping aspect. So similarly, like when you think about stress coping, you can easily start to think about that. If you are stressed in your everyday life, what can you do to relieve that stress? The same kind of question was asked for Technostress, and there are more ways, but I kind of tried to summarize, like or maybe even put them to 3 categories here, the 3 ways that people usually use for coping. And this is something where I think the individual differences start to also show. And maybe you can select and maybe see what is kind of your own path. By far the hardest is somehow that it's the proactive path. We have been doing some studies that look into how people start to kind of try to build some kind of a resilience over time for managing different situations. It's something that, developing different type of skill sets, as you might think about it, that it might be about learning how to use technologies in a certain way, but it's also the attitude part of how you react to different situations that are problematic and unexpected. There might be, of course, a personality issue, but there are also good indications that these are things that can be learned in a way. So proactive part, trying to kind of prepare for to some extent, unknown. The second path is this kind of active. So that basically you try to modify the IT, when, where, how you use technology. You try to modify that is optimum for you. So basically, if you think about those IT interruptions, it's that you try to somehow make it moderate in a way for you, so that you kind of try to eliminate. You start to go to the settings, privacy settings, email settings, notification settings, and also maybe think about when you are using technology and why. For instance, after the workday, you don't go to Teams or Zoom or some other, you don't look at your messages or emails anymore. Easier said than done, but this is basically the active part. The third one is more the human. All of us are humans. I think there are things that we can control, and there are things that not. I think we as humans were impulsive. We react to stimuli. So basically, the reactive way is basically just when there are situations that are coming your way that could be stressful, is that you are somehow maybe venting your feelings. I mean, we all been there, cursing or something, like for the machine that doesn't work, or that there's just something that is too much, or we try to somehow distance ourselves from the situation, not thinking about it or just doing something else. But this is basically just trying to this situation is too much. I'm try to somehow escape it. But again, if you think about which of the 3 ways is better than the other, probably all of us could maybe, without big survey, think that maybe the reactive one is the most, not the favorable one. So if you're only left with the third option, do something about it. But it's probably not a good option. But so we did some of the studies. I don't go detailed into this findings, but basically we identified that we did lots of surveys and interviews for different occupations, people in very different types of jobs, and we identified that these different proactive, active, and reactive, all of them are in use, and people use them also in different combinations. One of the things that we found really interesting is that people who are quite well equipped, they have a tendency to prepare in advance. Again, don't look at I'm all about these boxes and arrows. I like boxes and arrows. You don't have to try to decipher them. But basically, in some of the large studies that we did in the people who are in the work life, we identified that when they are equipped with some of this proactive way, they try to develop their skills, in time, and also that they have a tendency to go quite optimistically into like a problematic situation, is that then basically all of these kind of a natural things that come every now and then for us, trying to ventilate our feelings, the more the reactive things, they don't matter as much in a way that you definitely will have this, but if it's the only thing that you have, there were clear indications that people are less productive at work and they are also less motivated. So it was kind of obvious that when these proactive measures are in place, people weren't, these reactive things don't do as much harm. It's just a way of kind of, okay, I'm ventilating now my feelings, but again, I have this under my control. So there are clear indications that actually developing certain types of, buffer for technology use situation is really helpful. The problem here is that most of the ways for coping are intentional. So there needs to be determination. So we have identified that people know that, okay, I could make this easier for me, or if it's something of a work situation that in my work team we use technology in a certain way, it just doesn't fit me in a way, but I'm not doing much about it. And you see over time that you are thinking about quitting your job or something because you don't like the ways of how you utilize technology over time, is that many of the ways is about determination, and they are not necessarily just about how you use technology, but they are also that it might relate to how you plan and what you agree with your own colleagues. So that's the thing. So one of the things that we also identified in the set of studies is that the most problematic things for coping with and mitigating is, okay, you need to have the determination, but there's always some kind of a change that makes you lose something. And this is the thing, that people don't want to lose something. Again, if you have an access to whenever I want, I can take my Instagram feed and be exposed to nice cat videos. I want, if I want to, I can do it. So that I don't necessarily want to lose that in a way. And if I want to have open my emails and be exposed to, okay, they were nothing, but I could at least check it. The problematic thing usually is that it requires some kind of a change in mindsets, and usually losing something. So there's always a trade-off. And that's, I think, what people don't think about enough in terms of Technostress, is that in one study we kind of argued, but it was based on empirical findings, but we noticed that people go to the path of Technostress similarly as going downstream. You can think about it, it's rather easy. And it's often done in a way that technology itself is designed in a way that, of course, you might think about that they want to lure you in, and also like use it for more purposes, for Instagram, adding different types of filters, or making your social media posts more attractive in a way that you have different types of add-ons that are kind of endless also in many social media platforms, in a way that when you kind of adopt them in a way, it's very easy to get to the path that you identify that there are some situations that get problematic. So it might be social problems at home, or again work motivation, or just continued strain. So basically the downhill in a way that you notice that something started to be wrong, and not necessarily completely wrong, but it's something that that your quality of life isn't as good as you want to. And this is the place where usually when people know that something is going really wrong, that's usually when people feel it's kind of the opportunity for the turning point, for the mitigating and going kind of upstream. So we kind of have this tendency that regulating your own behavior, doing changes in the way you use technology, and also, which is one of the hardest part, about agreements of your work colleagues who have very different ways of using technology. Some don't have any work-life balance. They just, they prefer to work late evenings, but you still need to work with them. And again, will you adapt the same kind of work, like a work culture in a way, or do you find some kind of a way that works for both? So that's the kind of the problematic part, is that how you make the situation better in a way that you can introduce the change. And this is usually where people they're kind of relaxed in a way that you probably cannot easily get out of the situation. And I see that myself in myself as well. We have identified that for instance, the way that we are getting inspired about use of technology, that it can be extremely helpful in many ways. For instance, to get inspired about things, that we have a flow in the ways we use technology. But that's the kind of the problem that we have identified there, is that it's one of the key sources of Technostress in a way, because it's often the kind of the normative things. It's something that we, are kind of hidden things in our work climate in a way, so that we think that because otherwise other people are using technology in a certain way, I should use it in the same way as well. You get excited and you kind of get into the flow and hit it to the downstream where things start easily go wrong. So we try to somehow in these presentations and in these studies try to make people think that what is the kind of the good balance of being heavily exposed to different type of information streams and different types of Technostress creators, and what you can eliminate basically. And usually the more social, more you are intertwined into the work of others in a way that you work in work teams, that you are depending on each other's inputs. I think the more Technostress can be more severe in a way. The more you are a kind of a lone soldier in a way that you don't necessarily communicate too much in social media or use technology, it's mainly for your own benefit and own use. You're usually more covered in a way, and not that the problem doesn't get as big. But as mentioned, I do quite a lot of the research around virtual reality use in work life, but also like different types of AI tools. Is that we have also started to understand that with the introduction of certain technologies that kind of are embedded rather forcefully into our work. For instance, different types of AI tools, such as ChatGPT, is that it also changes the game in a way. So that I think we have to be more. I think we have to have a better, capabilities in understanding where the trade-off is, in a way that we understand the way we can cope, but also in a work situations, how we can design our work and our activities in a way that it can stay somehow favorable, that people don't start to lose motivation for their work and with their jobs. And again, I've been in the some work communities in the last couple of years that the turn of rate for people to actually quit their jobs has been quite high, and many of the things is what you have in these presentations that you often think that might be quite self-evident, but they are quite tricky in a way to manage. So as a technology adoption and acceptance researcher, I still feel that there are more positives. Again, this is what I want to say as the kind of a concluding words of my presentation, is that I'm not against technology. I use it. We are dependent on it in our own work, and that's something that I promote a lot to organizations, how they may use new kinds of tools. But I think we just have to be quite good in terms of finding the kind of the sweet spot where it can still bring benefits and not go to those reduced performance, severe burnouts and so on. So that's something that I want you to reflect a bit after this presentation also on what mechanisms do you have at play, and try to monitor when there have been problems occurring in your life or work, in your daily life or work life due to technology use, because I think that's when good things will happen over time if you monitor that a bit. And Yoda, as it's defeat the dark side, you must. So thank you.